Welcome to Story Planet. Tonight, we're excited to offer you 5 interesting stories. Each one will take you to a different time and place, but they're all connected in subtle and surprising ways. As you settle in, let your curiosity guide you through these tales, discovering the hidden threads that bind them together. Relax, get cozy, and prepare for a calm yet. Story 1. The Silver Pocket Watch. A Gift of Time. In the heart of a quiet European town, nestled between a bakery and a bookbinder's shop, stood Jonas Watchmakers, a quaint little store that had been a part of the town for generations. The bell above the door jingled softly whenever a customer entered, and inside, the smell of polished wood and metal mixed with the comforting warmth of freshly brewed tea. Edward Sullivan had been an apprentice in that shop for nearly a decade. He had come as a boy of 14, eager to learn the art of watchmaking, and now, at 23, he was a skilled craftsman, able to fix even the most delicate and intricate mechanisms. Every day, he found joy in the routine of his work, the steady ticking of the clocks, the soft glow of the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, the quiet conversations with customers who came not just for repairs, but for the peaceful atmosphere the shop provided. One such afternoon, with the golden light filtering through the glass, Edward was carefully working on a client's pocket watch, his hands steady and precise, when Mr. Jonas, the elderly owner of the shop, called to him from behind the counter. "Edward," Mr. Jonas said, his voice a gentle rumble that seemed to match the rhythm of the ticking clocks around him. "Come here, lad. There's something I need to give you." Edward set down his tools and wiped his hands on a cloth, curious as he approached his mentor. Mr. Jonas stood beside the counter, a small, polished wooden box in his hands. The box was old, the edges worn smooth by time, and when he opened it, Edward's breath caught. Inside was the most beautiful pocket watch he had ever seen. Its silver casing gleamed in the soft light, and delicate engravings of stars and vines adorned its surface, as if the very essence of time had been captured within the intricate designs. "This watch has been in my family for generations," Mr. Jonas began, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "My father gave it to me when I was your age, and his father gave it to him before that. Now, it's your turn to carry it." Edward felt a lump form in his throat. He had admired the watch for years, but he never imagined it would be passed down to him. The weight of it in his hands felt solid, grounding, as though it connected him to something much larger than himself, a legacy of timekeepers who had cherished every second, every moment. "Thank you, sir," Edward said quietly, his voice filled with awe and gratitude. Mr. Jonas smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Remember, Edward, time is not just something we measure. It's something we live. Every second holds a moment, a memory, and this watch will remind you of that." Edward nodded, understanding the weight of the responsibility that came with such a gift. From that moment on, the silver pocket watch became his constant companion, ticking softly in his pocket as he carried on the traditions of the watchmakers before him. A life in balance years passed, and Edward grew into his role as the town's trusted watchmaker. The shop, which had once been Mr. Jonas's, was now his, and though the elderly man had retired to a quiet cottage by the sea, his presence was still felt in every corner of the shop. The shelves were lined with clocks of all shapes and sizes, their rhythmic ticking creating a soothing symphony that filled the room with a sense of calm. The shop had become more than just a place of business. It was a refuge for the townspeople, a place where they could escape the rush of the outside world and lose themselves in the gentle flow of time. Many came not only to have their watches repaired, but to sit by the large window that overlooked the town square, sipping tea and sharing stories with Edward as they watched the world go by. One autumn afternoon, as the leaves outside turned shades of red and gold, an old friend of Edward's walked into the shop. Thomas, whom Edward had known since childhood, hadn't visited in years, and the sight of him brought a smile to Edward's face. "Thomas," Edward exclaimed, embracing his friend, "it's been too long." The two men sat by the window, drinking tea and catching up on the years that had passed. They reminisced about their younger days, shared news of family and friends, and laughed about old memories. As they talked, Edward found himself reflecting on the passage of time, how quickly the years had flown by, and yet how each moment had been filled with meaning. When Thomas finally rose to leave, the sun had begun to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the town. Edward walked him to the door, and as they said their goodbyes, Edward glanced down at the silver pocket watch, which had been ticking steadily in his pocket all day. For the first time in years, he noticed something unusual. The engraving on the back of the watch seemed to shimmer in the fading light, almost as if it were glowing. He held the watch closer, curious, but before he could examine it further, the shop bell chimed again, signaling another customer. With a smile, Edward pocketed the watch and turned to greet the newcomer. The mystery of the glowing engraving pushed to the back of his mind, for now. A new beginning. As the years continued to pass, the town around Edward changed in small but noticeable ways. New shops opened, old ones closed, and the faces in the square grew older. But within the walls of Jonas Watchmakers, time seemed to move at its own pace, a slower, more deliberate rhythm that allowed people to pause, to reflect, and to appreciate the moments that made up their lives. Edward had always found peace in the steady routine of his work. There was something meditative about the precision of watchmaking, about the way each tiny gear and spring fit together to create something larger than the sum of its parts. And yet, as the seasons turned and the years unfolded, Edward began to feel a quiet longing for something more. It wasn't that he was unhappy, far from it. His life was full of small joys, from the simple pleasure of a cup of tea in the morning to the warmth of a friend's company in the evening. But there was a sense that time, like the ticking of the silver watch in his pocket, was moving forward, and he wasn't sure where it was leading him. One crisp autumn morning, as the leaves fell in golden showers outside his window, Edward decided to take a walk. He left the shop in the care of his assistant and set off toward the park, the silver watch tucked safely in his coat pocket. The air was cool and fresh, and the sound of birdsong filled the quiet spaces between his thoughts. As he walked, he reflected on the years that had passed, on the people he had met, the stories he had heard, the moments that had shaped him. Each memory felt like a piece of a larger puzzle, and though he didn't yet see the full picture, he knew it was there, waiting for him to discover it. When he reached the park, Edward found a bench beneath a large oak tree and sat down, watching as the sunlight filtered through the leaves. The world around him seemed to slow, and for a moment he felt as though he were the only person in the world. He pulled out the silver pocket watch and held it in his hands, feeling the smooth, familiar weight of it. The engraving on the back, which had shimmered faintly that day with Thomas, seemed to glow again, and as Edward traced the delicate lines with his finger, he realized something. Time wasn't just something to be measured or counted. It was something to be experienced, something to be lived fully in each and every moment. With a deep breath, Edward smiled and tucked the watch back into his pocket. He didn't know where time would take him next, but he knew that whatever lay ahead, he would greet it with open arms, ready to embrace the beauty of each passing second. Story 2. Time to Fly. The Old Attic. In a small, quiet village surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests, Evelyn lived with her family in a cozy stone cottage. The cottage had been in the family for generations, and every corner seemed to tell a story. Whether it was the well-worn fireplace, where evenings were spent in warmth and laughter, or the attic filled with forgotten treasures from the past. Evelyn loved the attic. It was a place of mystery and discovery, where time seemed to stand still. On rainy afternoons, when the soft patter of raindrops tapped against the windows, she would climb the narrow wooden stairs to the attic and lose herself among the old trunks and dusty shelves. She would sift through the remnants of her ancestors' lives, faded letters, old photographs, and trinkets that had once held great meaning, but had long since been forgotten. One such rainy afternoon, while the clouds hung low and gray over the village, Evelyn ventured up to the attic once more. Her fingers trailed along the edges of old boxes, her mind wandering as she imagined the lives of those who had once owned these objects. In the far corner of the attic, beneath a pile of old quilts, she discovered a small, polished wooden box. Curious, Evelyn opened the box and found a silver pocket watch nestled inside. The watch was exquisite, its surface smooth and gleaming, with delicate engravings of stars and swirling vines. It felt heavy in her hand, as though it carried with it the weight of many years, many lives. She wound the watch carefully, unsure if it would still work after all this time. To her surprise, the watch ticked softly, the sound almost comforting in the stillness of the attic. She held it to her ear, listening to the steady rhythm, and for a moment it felt as though the world around her had slowed, the rain outside falling in a gentle, unhurried pattern. Evelyn smiled, slipping the watch into her pocket as she made her way back downstairs, unaware that the simple act of winding the watch would soon lead her into a world where time flowed differently, where moments stretched and lingered, and the beauty of stillness was revealed in unexpected ways. The world slows. In the days that followed, Evelyn found herself carrying the silver pocket watch with her wherever she went. She was drawn to its steady ticking, the way it seemed to anchor her in the present moment, no matter where she was. Whether she was walking through the village square, sitting by the river bank, or tending to the small garden behind the cottage, the watch remained a constant companion, its quiet rhythm a reminder of the passage of time. But soon, Evelyn began to notice something unusual. Whenever she wound the watch, the world around her seemed to slow down, not in a dramatic, jarring way, but gently, as though the moments themselves were being stretched out, allowing her to savor the beauty of each one. The birds in the trees seemed to sing more softly, their songs lingering in the air. The wind that rustled the leaves of the tall oak trees moved at a leisurely pace, as if it had all the time in the world. One morning, as she sat by the river bank, watching the water flow over the smooth stones, Evelyn wound the watch and closed her eyes, letting the sound of the ticking wash over her. When she opened her eyes again, the world around her had grown still. The ripples on the water seemed frozen in place. The leaves in the trees barely swayed, and the birds that had been fluttering from branch to branch now hovered mid-flight, suspended in time. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She stood up slowly, walking along the edge of the river, marveling at the stillness that had settled over everything. It was as though she had stepped into a painting where every detail was frozen in a moment of perfect tranquility. Her heart swelled with a sense of wonder. The world was filled with so much beauty, so many small, fleeting moments that were often overlooked in the rush of daily life. But with the watch, she could slow down, pause, and truly appreciate the magic of those moments. As the day faded into evening and the sun dipped low on the horizon, Evelyn wound the watch once more, and slowly the world began to move again. The birds resumed their flight, the wind whispered through the trees, and the river flowed steadily onward, carrying with it the quiet passage of time. The evening walk. As the weeks passed, Evelyn continued to carry the watch with her, using its gentle magic to slow the world whenever she felt the need for stillness. She found that it wasn't about freezing time or escaping from the flow of life. It was about creating space, about allowing herself to breathe, to reflect, and to be present in the beauty of the world around her. One evening, as the sun began to set and the village was bathed in a warm, golden light, Evelyn decided to take a walk through the woods. The air was cool and crisp, and the scent of pine and earth filled her lungs as she followed the familiar path that wound through the trees. The silver watch ticked softly in her pocket, its rhythm matching the unhurried pace of her footsteps. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of an owl. As she walked, Evelyn felt a deep sense of peace settle over her, a feeling that she was exactly where she was meant to be, in this moment, with no need to rush or worry about what lay ahead. As she reached a clearing, she paused, her breath catching at the sight before her. The sky above had turned a deep shade of indigo, and the first stars of the evening twinkled faintly overhead. The trees cast long shadows across the ground, and the last rays of sunlight filtered through the branches, painting the landscape in shades of gold and purple. Evelyn wound the watch and sat down on a large, smooth stone at the edge of the clearing. The world slowed around her, the soft breeze stilling, the distant sounds of the forest fading into the background. She closed her eyes, letting the quiet embrace her, feeling the gentle ticking of the watch in her hand. For a long while, she simply sat there, savoring the stillness, the peace that came with being fully present in the moment. Time no longer felt like something to be measured or controlled. It was a gift, something to be cherished in all its fleeting beauty. As the stars grew brighter and the moon rose high in the sky, Evelyn opened her eyes and smiled. She knew, deep in her heart, that she had found something precious, not just the magic of the silver watch, but the magic of slowing down, of appreciating the quiet moments that made life so full of wonder. And in that stillness, she knew she would carry the lessons of the watch with her, wherever her journey through time might take her. Story 3. The clock strikes midnight, the midnight watch. In the heart of a small, sleepy town, where the lamplight flickered softly along cobblestone streets, Detective Clara Winters sat at her desk, watching the clock on the wall. The hands moved slowly, ticking their way toward midnight, and the room was filled with the quiet hum of time passing. Clara had always been drawn to the midnight hour, to the peaceful stillness that seemed to settle over the town when the rest of the world was asleep. It was during these quiet moments, when the streets were empty and the night stretched out before her, that she felt most at ease. The busyness of the day faded away, and all that remained was the gentle rhythm of time, ticking steadily onward. On this particular evening, as Clara sat alone in her office, her thoughts were on a small silver pocket watch that lay on the desk before her. The watch had been left at her doorstep earlier that day, wrapped in a simple cloth with no note or explanation. It was a beautiful object, its surface engraved with delicate patterns of stars and vines, and its ticking was soft and steady, like the heartbeat of time itself. There was something about the watch that intrigued Clara. It wasn't just its craftsmanship, though that alone was impressive, but the feeling it gave her when she held it. A sense of calm, of stillness, as though the watch carried within it the power to slow time, to stretch out the moments and allow her to breathe. As the clock on the wall struck midnight, Clara reached for the watch, winding it carefully before slipping it into her coat pocket. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and stepped out into the cool night air, ready for her usual midnight walk through the quiet streets of the town. The silver watch ticked gently in her pocket as she walked, its rhythm matching the slow, measured pace of her footsteps. The town was peaceful, the houses dark and still, and the only sound was the distant rustling of the trees as the wind whispered through the branches. Clara had walked these streets 1,000 times before, but tonight something felt different. There was a sense of calm that seemed to hang in the air, a stillness that went beyond the usual quiet of the night. It was as though time itself had slowed, allowing her to move through the world with a gentle, unhurried grace. She smiled to herself, her fingers brushing against the silver watch in her pocket. Whatever mystery the watch held, she was content to let it unfold in its own time. For now, she was happy to simply enjoy the peacefulness of the midnight hour. A quiet mystery. As Clara continued her midnight stroll, she found herself reflecting on the mystery of the silver pocket watch. Who had left it at her door, and why? It was a question that lingered in the back of her mind, but it didn't trouble her. Instead, she felt a quiet curiosity, a sense that the answer would come to her in its own time, just as everything else did. The streets of the town were familiar to her, but tonight they seemed to hold a different kind of magic. The lamplights cast long, soft shadows across the cobblestones, and the moon, high above, bathed everything in a gentle, silvery glow. The air was cool and crisp, and Clara breathed it in deeply, feeling a sense of contentment settle over her. As she passed by the small park at the edge of the town square, Clara paused, listening to the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. It was a sound she had heard 1,000 times before, but tonight it seemed different, softer, slower, as though the wind itself had been caught in the spell of the silver watch. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the watch, holding it in the palm of her hand. Its ticking was steady and reassuring, and as Clara stood there in the stillness of the night, she found herself feeling grateful for the quiet moments that made up her life. She thought of the people she had met over the years, the cases she had solved, the mysteries she had unraveled. Each one had been a part of the tapestry of her life, woven together by the passage of time. And now, in this moment, with the silver watch ticking softly in her hand, she felt a deep sense of peace. Time, she realized, wasn't just something to be measured or solved. It was something to be lived, one quiet moment at a time. The midnight watchkeeper. As Clara made her way back to her office, the silver watch still ticking gently in her hand, she found herself thinking about the nature of time. She had spent years chasing after answers, trying to solve the mysteries that life presented to her. But now, with the silver watch in her possession, she felt a shift in her perspective. Time wasn't something that needed to be chased or solved. It was something that simply was. It moved forward, steadily and unchanging. But within that steady rhythm, there were moments of stillness, moments of quiet, where one could pause and reflect on the beauty of life. As she reached her office and sat back down at her desk, Clara placed the watch on the table before her, watching as the moonlight cast a soft glow over its surface. The mystery of the watch, who had left it for her, and why, was still unsolved, but Clara didn't mind. She knew that, in time, the answers would come. For now, she was content to sit in the stillness of the midnight hour, the soft ticking of the watch keeping her company. It was a reminder that life was made up of moments, some fleeting, some lingering, but each one a part of the greater whole. And as the night stretched on, Clara closed her eyes and smiled, knowing that she had found peace in the rhythm of time. Story 4: The Watchmaker's Dream, a Dream of Time. In a quiet laboratory on the outskirts of a bustling, futuristic city, Dr. Alex Reed sat at his desk, surrounded by the gentle hum of his instruments. Outside, the sprawling metropolis stretched toward the horizon, its towering buildings illuminated by the glow of countless lights. The city was alive with energy and progress. Yet here in his lab, time seemed to move at a slower pace. The rain had begun to fall earlier in the evening, tapping softly against the windows like a rhythmic lullaby. The world outside might have been busy, but here, within the calm of his workspace, Alex found peace. He had always felt at home in the quiet, an odd contrast to the city that never seemed to sleep. On his desk, amidst his research papers and data screens, sat a small silver pocket watch. It had been a gift from his grandfather, a man who had lived in a much simpler time. The watch had belonged to his grandfather's father, and its steady ticking had accompanied Alex through long nights of study and reflection. Tonight, as the rain whispered outside and the world seemed to fade into the background, Alex found himself drawn once again to the pocket watch. He picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in his hand, and ran his fingers over the intricate engravings on the casing. Stars and swirling vines adorned the surface, each detail beautifully crafted, as if the watch had captured a piece of the universe itself. As he wound the watch, the soft ticking filled the quiet space around him. It was a sound he had always found comforting, constant, reliable, like the passage of time itself. Yet, there was something more to it. Over the years, he had begun to wonder if the watch carried with it more than just the ability to mark time, the flow of time. Dr. Reed's research revolved around the nature of time, how it moved, how it could be measured, and how it influenced the fabric of reality. He had spent countless hours studying the flow of time, running simulations and experiments to understand the very essence of this mysterious force. Yet, despite all his findings, there was always something just beyond his grasp. Something about time that eluded even the most advanced scientific understanding. As Alex sat in his lab, listening to the ticking of the pocket watch, he couldn't help but wonder if the answers he sought were simpler than he had once believed. Perhaps time wasn't something to be controlled or manipulated. It was something to be experienced, something to be lived. The rain outside grew heavier, the soft patter becoming a steady rhythm, and Alex found his thoughts drifting. He closed his eyes, letting the sound of the rain and the ticking of the watch merge into a gentle symphony. For a moment, it felt as though the world around him had slowed, as though time itself had softened, allowing him to rest in the stillness. His mind wandered back to the stories his grandfather had told him, tales of simpler times when people lived without the pressures of modern technology and constant progress. There had been something peaceful in those stories, something that resonated with Alex even now, in the fast-paced world he inhabited. With a deep breath, Alex opened his eyes and gazed down at the pocket watch in his hand. Its ticking had slowed, just slightly, and as he watched the second hand move, he felt a curious sensation wash over him, a sense that time, in this moment, was not as linear as he had always believed. A moment of stillness. Intrigued by the subtle shift in the watch's rhythm, Alex leaned back in his chair, allowing himself to sink deeper into the moment. The ticking continued, steady yet unhurried, as if the watch had taken on a life of its own. The usual urgency of his research fell away, and in its place was a sense of calm, of being exactly where he was meant to be. He realized then that he had spent so much of his life chasing after the mysteries of time, trying to unlock its secrets, that he had forgotten the simplest truth. Time was not something to be conquered or understood. It was something to be experienced, one moment at a time. With the watch in his hand, Alex let his mind wander. He thought of the countless hours he had spent working, studying, and striving for answers, and he realized that those hours, while important, were not the only measure of time well spent. There were other moments, smaller, quieter moments, that had been just as meaningful. The evening spent with his grandfather, listening to stories by the fire. The quiet walks through the park, where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. The time spent in the presence of those he cared about, even when no words were spoken. These were the moments that truly defined time, not the ticking of a clock or the passing of hours on a calendar. As the rain began to slow outside, Alex wound the watch once more, listening to its quiet ticking. He knew now that the watch wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a reminder to live in the present, to savor the moments that made up his life, and to find peace in the flow of time rather than in the pursuit of mastering it. Story 5. Echoes in the Sands. The Silent Desert. In the vast expanse of the desert, where the sand dunes stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and the wind whispered softly across the landscape, Jasmine sat by a small campfire, gazing out at the twilight sky. The sun had just begun to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, and the desert, which had been scorching hot just hours before, was now cool and calm. Jasmine had always loved the desert. There was a stillness here that she couldn't find anywhere else, a quiet that allowed her to escape the noise and busyness of the world. The vastness of the landscape made her feel small, but in a comforting way, as if she were part of something much larger than herself. Beside her, on the ground, lay a small silver pocket watch. It had been passed down to her by her grandmother, who had carried it on many of her own adventures. The watch was old, its casing worn smooth by years of use, but it still ticked steadily, a quiet reminder of the passage of time. As the fire crackled softly and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jasmine reached for the watch and wound it carefully. The ticking filled the silence, a soft, rhythmic sound that blended with the gentle rustling of the desert wind. She held the watch in her hand, feeling its familiar weight, and closed her eyes, letting the stillness of the desert wash over her. The desert was a place where time seemed to move differently. The days were long, the nights even longer, and yet there was no sense of urgency here. Time in the desert felt fluid, unhurried, as though the world itself had slowed to match the steady rhythm of the watch in her hand. A journey of reflection. Jasmine had been traveling through the desert for weeks, moving from one oasis to the next, exploring the hidden corners of this vast, mysterious land. The desert had always called to her, ever since she was a child, listening to her grandmother's stories of distant places and forgotten ruins. Now, as an adult, Jasmine had made it her mission to explore those places for herself, to uncover the secrets hidden beneath the sands. But it wasn't just the adventure that drew her to the desert. It was the stillness, the sense of peace that came from being surrounded by nothing but open sky and endless dunes. In the desert, there were no distractions, no demands on her time. There was only the present moment and the quiet ticking of the watch in her pocket. As she walked through the desert each day, Jasmine found herself reflecting on the passage of time. The silver watch had been with her on every journey, its steady ticking a constant companion. It had marked the moments of excitement and discovery, but also the moments of quiet reflection, when the only sound was the wind sweeping across the dunes. She thought of her grandmother, who had carried the watch before her, and the stories she had told of her own adventures. Jasmine wondered if her grandmother had felt the same sense of peace in the desert, if she too had found solace in the stillness and the steady ticking of the watch. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and the shadows of the dunes grew long, Jasmine paused at the top of a hill and looked out over the vast landscape before her. The desert stretched out in every direction, a sea of golden sand that seemed to go on forever. It was both beautiful and humbling, a reminder that time, like the desert, was endless and ever-changing. With a deep breath, Jasmine wound the watch once more, the ticking filling the quiet space around her. She smiled to herself, feeling a sense of connection, not just to the desert, but to the generations of her family who had carried this watch before her, each of them finding their own peace in the passage of time. The stillness of time. That night, as Jasmine sat by the fire, the silver watch ticking softly in her hand, she thought about the journey she had taken. The desert had shown her many things: hidden oases, ancient ruins, and the vast beauty of the natural world. But it had also taught her the importance of stillness, of slowing down and appreciating the moments that made up her life. In the busy world beyond the desert, time moved quickly, and there was always something demanding her attention. But here, in the quiet of the desert night, time moved at its own pace, and there was nothing to do but be present in the moment. As the fire crackled and the stars twinkled overhead, Jasmine felt a deep sense of contentment. She had found what she had been searching for, not just in the desert, but within herself. The silver watch had guided her on her journey, reminding her that time was not something to be rushed or controlled. It was something to be lived, one peaceful moment at a time. With the watch still ticking softly in her hand, Jasmine lay back on the sand, gazing up at the stars. The desert, with its vast silence and open spaces, had given her the peace she had been seeking. And in that peace, she knew that she would carry the lessons of the desert with her, wherever her journey might take her next. The timeless journey. The silver pocket watch had passed through many hands over the years, each person finding their own meaning in its quiet, steady ticking. From Edward the watchmaker to Evelyn the dreamer, from Clara the detective to Alex the scientist, and finally to Jasmine, who had found peace in the stillness of the desert, the watch had become more than just a timepiece. It was a reminder that time was not something to be measured or controlled, but something to be experienced. It was a reminder to slow down, to savor the moments that made life meaningful, and to find peace in the rhythm of time. Each person who had carried the watch had found their own way of connecting with its quiet magic. For some, it was a reminder of the past, of memories long gone but never forgotten. For others, it was a guide, helping them navigate the present with a sense of calm and purpose. And for others still, it was a symbol of hope, a reminder that the future held endless possibilities waiting to be discovered. As the watch continued its journey, passing from one generation to the next, it carried with it the echoes of all those who had come before, each of them finding their own peace in the flow of time. And though the watch's journey was far from over, it had already touched the lives of many, leaving behind a trail of quiet moments and gentle reflections. Time, after all, was a gift to be cherished, one beautiful, peaceful moment at a time. Thank you for traveling through time with us tonight on Story Planet. We hope the journey sparked your imagination and left you with a sense of wonder. If the stories resonated with you, why not keep the adventure going? You might consider liking, sharing, or subscribing so we can continue exploring more magical worlds and hidden connections together. Until next time, may your nights be restful, your dreams extraordinary, and your curiosity ever growing.